Good evening and welcome to another edition of The Addicts Advocate. I'm your host, Dusty Dean, and it is my pleasure to introduce Ashley Ryan. Ashley Ryan is currently the founder of Holistic Healing Path out of New Jersey, and she offers telehealth services on a wide variety of things. I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to let her get into that. But she's also someone who is in recovery and has a wealth of knowledge and understands what it's like to be suffering with an addiction. How are you, Ashley?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I like to just get right into it. I like to hear the story. Give us a little bit about your background. What made you realize that you had an addiction and that you needed to seek help, that you couldn't just remedy it yourself?
So I got sober when I was 18, not by choice. So there was a lot of circumstances that kind of led to my entry into recovery. Prior sobriety date is December 3rd, 2006. So coming up on 17 and a half years. So prior to getting sober, I was living with my parents, in my family home. And I had gone to a music festival that summer of 2006, had a really negative experience, ended up calling my dad. He came and drove 6 hours to pick me up from this music festival to bring me home. And kind of the deal was that if he were to do that, then I had to agree to go into addiction counseling, because I had had a drug addiction and a problem for many years prior to that. I started using when I was 12, progressed until I was 18. So by that point, I was pretty heavy into, my drug of choice and moving around, doing a lot of things. And so I came home and I saw that drug and alcohol counselor starting in September of 2006. And things just progressively got worse and worse. I was in complete denial. I'm 18, I'm supposed to be having fun and, all of the excuses of why this was fine for me. And so it was like right before Thanksgiving, the therapist had contacted my family and told my family that if you don't do an intervention on her, then she'll be dead by Christmas. And so like right before Thanksgiving, a side note that I was working for my aunt at a doctor's office at the time. The worst place for me to be. I was like putting patients in the wrong rooms. I was a mess. And they actually ended up firing me. But my mom was like, we're going to do an intervention on her in a week. Can you just keep letting her come there so she thinks that she has a job? So I actually ended up working at this doctor's office for free. They just like put me in the back. I didn't even know that I was fired, but it was like all part of trying to keep me in the area. And then on December 3rd, my family said that we were going to go get breakfast. And we ended up at my therapist's office. And I'm like, what are we doing here? And my parents were like, we just have to meet with her really quickly and just go over a few things. And then we're going to go out. And I'm like, okay. And we get into her office and all my bank accounts were frozen. Everything was done. If I didn't go into treatment that day, I was going to be homeless. I had nothing, no options. And so it was either, homelessness coming into December in New Jersey or go to treatment. And I decided to go to treatment, not because I was planning on getting sober, but to avoid consequences. So yeah, that's how I got it. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Before we get into the recovery side of it, so 12 years old.
Yes.
What instigated that?
So I actually smoked marijuana, smoked weed with my older brother's friends. So I have an older brother who's 16 months older than me. So we're super close in age. And I just always tended to be friends with who he was friends with. And he hated that, but I was kind of always around. And he had friends that were smoking and they thought it was fun to like get the little sister high. And so I started smoking weed at 12 and progressively got into hallucinogens. I was somebody who toured with and went around and did a lot of jam bands and was on festival routes and all sorts of things. So I kind of got into hallucinogens, and then from there, cocaine, progressed into heroin use at the end. And so, yeah, it just kind of slowly crept up over the years, but I started really young.
Do you think that marijuana is a gateway drug?
Well, I do, and I don't. I think that's a really hard question to answer black and white. I think if you have the predisposed factors of the disease of addiction, yes. But that doesn't apply to everybody. So I think you have to take into consideration a lot of other environmental, biological factors to make that statement. So for some people, absolutely. For other people, no.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Family life was good though. There was nothing really that was catalyzing a need to feel better. It was just more of it was a fun thing that got out of hand.
Yeah, so I mean, I was born restless, irritable, and discontent. And that just like was in my bones from the beginning. So I was raised by my biological mother and my biological father, and he ended up leaving our lives when I was about I think kind of for good when I was like 6, and he popped in and out, and he had a history of alcoholism. Was a really unstable parent, and kind of came in and came out and caused a lot of strife over the years. I was blessed to have my stepdad come into our lives when I was 9, and he's been in my life ever since. So I was raised by 2 very loving parents, despite having an unstable biological parent. But, I was an addict before I was an addict. My first addiction was food. So I have a history of eating disorder. So I started with eating disorder. I progressed into self-harm. And then kind of substances fell on the heels of that. I was a soccer player for the majority of my life and was slated to kind of play in college. I was, really tracked to do really well with that. And that was kind of the thing that held me together for the most part. Like I was doing all of these addictive behaviors, but I found a lot of purpose in sports, and I found a lot of value. People, I wasn't valued for much because people knew that I was doing a lot of like unhealthy actions and behavior. So, but when it came to sports, I was really praised and, thought of as good. And I ended up getting injured my junior year and required surgery. And kind of after that surgery, I was told that, I would be lucky if I was 25% of the player that I was before my surgery. And it was basically at that point that my soccer career ended. I'd been playing since I was 3, and I didn't play my senior year of high school, which if high school sports, that's like your year. And so what had happened was I kind of just let go. And once I lost soccer, I kind of lost the only thing that was my real tether to not going completely off the rails. And so once that was gone, it kind of I let go of everything.
Yeah. It's tough. It's tough. I've got a little one who's on that same trajectory, and yeah, there's something to be said about holding on too tightly to something in case something doesn't work out the way we plan, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we go into rehab reluctantly because we're basically forced to.
Yes.
I never hear a story that basically says I was done after that point. It's usually, I relapsed at least 4 or 5 times. But you sound like you stuck it out, huh?
I did, yeah. So relapse is not part of my story. So I got clean at 18, and I have stayed clean ever since then.
Good for you.
So it's not been without, its own trials and tribulations, but I went into a program, and I was 18 when I went in, but still considered an adolescent. So I had to go on to the adolescent unit. So I was with like all these younger kids. They made me stop smoking cigarettes, and I was so upset about everything. And so the way that the program was structured was you do 30 days, and kind of at the end of your 30 days, it's evaluated whether or not you need to go to extended and stay there for an additional 3 months, or if you can come home. And I mean, my parents would tell you, like, I was there like singing the sob story. I'm like, I'm going to change. Everything's going to be different, all of this stuff. And actually, like the night before my parents were supposed to come and have our whole meeting, like a bunch of my friends ran away, and they had this like whole plan. And they were like, you should come with us. And I'm like, no, I can't get sent to extended. And if I run, I'm going to get sent. So I need to stay here. So, I mean, I helped them like get out the door and everything. Like I was aiding and abetting, but I was like, I'm not going. The next morning, I got sent to extended anyway. They were like, there's no way you're coming home. And so I ended up spending 3 more months there. That time was a real blur for me. I think, I was so young and I was so confused about what was really happening. And really, was I really a drug addict? Was I really somebody who had these issues, or was I just going through things, and like, would it all level out eventually? I learned things while I was there, but it was such an insulated community that it was hard to practice anything that I was learning. You're just on the grounds all the time for 4 months. So it's difficult to like put that into practice. I came home after the 4 months and I didn't relapse. I stayed sober, but I just like went right back to old behaviors. Prior to going into treatment, I was selling drugs. And I went kind of right back into what I was doing before. And 30 days to the day of when I came home from inpatient treatment, my parents had a second intervention and they sent me back to my inpatient program for a week. And from there, I went to a halfway sober living outpatient program style treatment in California for another 3 months after that. So yeah, I required a lot of treatment to get to where I was, because I bucked so hard against that I had to do this. But in addition to what was going on in my life personally, I had these other situations, with my friends and family and all of these things. And so I went to that program in California and stayed there for 3 months and then came home after that.
And life was different than at that point.
So coming out of the program in California, I came home. I was home for 10 days and then I moved away to college. I had applied to college while I was in the program. I got accepted. I came home and I moved there. And as part of the discharge plan from my last facility, they had a program that was called AIR. I don't even think it exists anymore, but it's basically a drug testing program that I was on for like 2 years. And I would get a call from this woman in New Mexico and she would say, hey, you got to go give a urine today or you're going to go back to treatment. And so that went on for 2 years. So I came home, I was on AIR. I went away to school in Pennsylvania and they had a sober dorm, but it was really just a floor of a dorm that they said was sober, but it really wasn't, which ended up not really being like a big deal at the time. I found a really great group of friends who I loved, and like they were so instrumental to my early years of recovery. And I stayed there. I was kind of like always of the mindset of like, well, when everybody settles down, I complete AIR, everybody just kind of takes a breather. Like I'll be able to figure out whatever this is. And if I want to go back, I'll go back. If I want to start drinking, like I never really thought it would be forever. I just always kind of was like, well, let's just get to the next hurdle, right? Like I have to get through inpatient and then let's get through outpatient and then let's get through AIR. And just like that marker kept moving out and out, which I ultimately has allowed me to stay sober for a long time. Cause then it was like, well, let's graduate college. Let's just kind of keep doing this until we get to the next thing and then we'll make another decision, and I always tell people that for me, that's been a great tool, is to kind of say like, I can choose to go back, but let's get over this next 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, let's see where we are. So yeah, I stayed there for 2 years and I loved it. But by the end of the 2 years I was, and I'm not saying this like, metaphorically, I was literally the only sober person on that campus that did not drink at all. There was no other student. It was a very small college town in rural Pennsylvania. Recovery was not big. And I was the only college student that attended meetings out there. Everybody in those meetings were like 65 and older. I was 19. And by the end of 2 years, it was kind of like, either I stay here with my friends and a place that I really do love, but I'm running a real high risk that I'm going to start drinking, or I leave and I need to move to a new school that has more resources, more availability for me to stay sober. And so it was really hard and I was really sad to leave that school. But, like in recovery, you're faced with choices. You have to make sacrifices. And at the time it was either I stay and most likely I would start drinking and probably return to full use, or I leave, and I chose to leave and transfer schools at that time.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely something important about, looking ahead in life, right? And looking at milestones, being excited about what's going to be happening in the future and setting goals, because, as addicts, it's like, now, give it to me now. And I want to feel better now. I don't have any patience. But, you touched on a point that's important is fortunately for you, you had a community and that's was an anchor. I find that that's such a saving grace for me. I've got people that I've went through recovery with, people that are, that I've established now lifelong relationships with. I feel like my friend circle is bigger than it's ever been, and I'll be 49 at the end of the year. But the other thing that I think that is important for people to understand is I know that when I was, 20 years battling weed and alcohol. And when I made the decision to go in, the notion of 30 days is like, okay, I can give that up in my life. And I was literally like, a week into it and I find out, well, wait a second, I got to do this other 90-day program too. And I got to do, and the reality of it is that people won't give up much more than 30 days. But, you're trying to rid 20 years worth of habits and, everything going on in here, that it's like, you got to give yourself the time, right?
Yeah.
You got to,
I mean, I look back and I think to myself, like, it's such a drop in the bucket, right? Like when you're sitting on the front end of it, it's catastrophic, especially at 18. I mean, 30 days is like a million years, right? And you're just, I cannot believe this is and then tack on another 6 months, another 7 months in treatment. I mean, I thought my life was never going to get better or anything was ever going to change. And now I sit here, 17 and a half years later, 36, and I'm like, 4 months is nothing, like it's such a small sacrifice for the life that I have cultivated and created. I would give up 7 months of my life a million times over to have the life that I have now. And I don't know that you always know that on the front end because it's so hard to see. That's where trusting people who are more, in recovery than you, professional people who tell you that, you will look back and say, yeah, you can take 7 months. No problem. If this is what I get, I'll give you a year. I'll give you 2, because there's so much time that we spend so frivolously in substance use, right? 7 months in active addiction. I didn't care, but you're going to ask me to spend 7 months to change the trajectory of my life. And I was like, absolutely not, and, hindsight is 20/20 and I get to look back and go, yeah, I'd give you that any day.
The interesting thing is that you did this all prior to leading up to, supposedly the golden years of partying, right? Being 21 and going out and having a great time and doing all the things that, we shouldn't be doing in our teenage years, but some of us do. Yeah. The interesting thing is that, when we're using our sense of time too is so different. So when we're sober, it's like everything is moving so stinking slow.
Yeah.
And you're like, I can't just stand a day. I can't be comfortable in my skin for one day. And you want me to do this for how many months? Or for the rest of my life, right? And that's the whole notion of one day at a time.
Yeah.
Do you find that you even have any triggers this far out?
I mean, it's funny because as I have changed, my disease has changed with me, right? So, I mean, I've built my life around the fact that I'm a recovering person, right? So it's my profession. I'm a clinical director of a substance abuse facility. I do this work professionally, personally. It's, the crux of my life is that I'm a recovering person. And so, to go back to active, like hardcore drug use is like, I can't even imagine it. I always tell people like, I used to be someone who could be on the streets and now I require like a 12-step skincare routine and a silk pillowcase and like an alarm clock that is the sunrise. Like, you know what I mean? I'm just not built for it anymore. I've really desensitized and created like a really soft lifestyle for myself. So it's like, I don't think about that kind of stuff. But I think about the things like, wow, I've never ordered a drink at a bar. I've never legally bought alcohol, right? I've never done those things. And I've never socially smoked weed in a way that was like with other adults who are not drug addicts, who are not also like really, in sick life situations. So my disease wants me to believe that I'm 36 now. I'm different. Things are different. Maybe there's a version of me that could exist who could drink and smoke, successfully, like California sober, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing that has come around. But like, that's where my disease works its way in, is trying to convince me that I can like be on Sex in the City. And it's like, well, you can't, and, like, it's just, those are the things that I find I have to go, right. Okay. That is the insidiousness of this disease, is that as I get better and wiser, so does it. So it knows, my disease knows not to be like, hey, do you want to do cocaine? Because it's like, no, that's insanity. I couldn't. But it's like, hey, have you considered like going to a bar and just like sitting down and ordering a drink as an adult, like a full-fledged adult? And that I go, interesting. Right. And I have to work through that and do all the things that I do. And yeah, so I find that those are the bigger things that come up, and they're very few and far between. I have a beautiful, healthy, happy, full life, but yeah, you don't eradicate addiction. You just learn to live with it a lot more gracefully, I think, over time.
Yeah. I was the same way. I mean, I was 20 years religiously with the weed, but I quit drinking for 2 different stints for 6-year periods. Mm-hmm. And both times was like, I've got this. I've got control of it. And boy, was I wrong. And the scary thing is that each relapse was progressively worse. Mm-hmm. And, it was the second one that really made me go, okay, I'm going to end well. And I can't control it anymore. Your family must be proud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
that's awesome.
I'm so blessed that I have an amazing, amazing support network in my family. So, my parents, they have been with me every step of the way. My stepdad and my mom, and I call him my dad because he's been in my life forever. And so I was really lucky and fortunate to have a family that was interested in getting into recovery with me. It was not, and I think that has a lot to do with because I was so young. I think that's a very different experience to be young and going through this process versus being a little older and your family's not as involved in your life. I mean, I was fully still dependent on my parents when I got sober. So they were intrinsically involved in my life, and then they wanted to also be that involved in my recovery. So, I'm so lucky to have them. I have my older brother who is phenomenal. And, when they went through the family program, when I was in treatment, there were some things I remember them talking to me about, and I remember them saying, and it's actually funny, I just moved recently and I just found all of my brother's letters to me that he wrote when he was at the family program. And I was like, oh my God, my heart, because he's 16 months older than me, but he's just like the sweetest. I call him Beamer because he smiles all the time. And I just remember reading those letters at 18 and I couldn't even grasp how they felt. And I read them now and I'm like, oh my God, like it hits you so deep, And so, yeah, they've been a beautiful and amazing support network. My mom texts me every 3rd of the month, and she has for 17 and a half years, like another month in recovery. Congratulations. Another month in recovery, like however hundreds of months that is at this point. Without fail, on the 3rd of every month, I get a text message from my mom that just says like, hey, you did it again. Like, congratulations.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So any gems of wisdom to share from your journey that, you wish other people recognized?
That healing isn't linear, that this isn't a process that you just come into and life gets better and you get better. It's okay to know that this is going to be hard and complex and messy. My recovery process has been anything but straight upwards, and I learned really early on that it wasn't going to just all turn out well. I had to work really, really hard at addressing and resolving other aspects of my life, right? Like I got sober, but I still had an eating disorder and I still worked with that for many years in sobriety. And even still, it creeps back into my life, and it's still something that I have to work on and keep a temperature on. And I think people get discouraged quickly when it doesn't just shoot upward and stay on that trajectory. And that's where, like, coming back to the place of just giving yourself a lot of grace and a lot of compassion. I've been through a lot in my years in recovery, and a lot of like resurgence of all sorts of symptoms. And I mean, even in this last year, I went through a divorce this past year, and I'm not somebody who's ever had to be on mental health medication. But in the last year, like, I had to say, like, okay, I'm waving the white flag. Like, I can't, paddleboard my way out of this one. Like, I need a little more help. And I had to just like allow myself to ask for additional help, right? With some medication, I'm still in therapy. Like, I still do a lot of those things. And sometimes, especially working in this field, right? I'm obviously working with people all the time, and they're like, oh my gosh, it must, you must have it all, and it must be together. And I'm like, dude, sometimes there are days I am holding it together at the seams, right? And that's not because I'm failing. It's because I'm human. Like, I'm a Buddhist by practice. And one of my favorite Buddhist teachers, he says, allow yourself to be diagnosed with the human condition. And I really resonate with that, because I think so many of us forget to be human, and we forget to say that it is going to get really messy, and you're going to hurt people, and you're going to make mistakes sober. You're going to do all sorts of atrocious things, maybe even in recovery, and you're still doing great, right? Two things are true, that even if you make really unskilled choices, you're still here, you're still valuable, and it's okay. Like, everything is fixable until you get high. And then some things become permanent. So I just like try to remind myself of that no matter what I do, no matter what happens, like, it is all fixable as long as I make one skillful choice.
Very well said. I've personally studied a lot of Buddhist scripture. I'm a Catholic by default, and my Catholicism is strong. My faith is very strong. Through my own ventures, even in addiction, there were a lot of things that resonated with me. Kind of touching on that, the thing that's fascinating to me is that, in a sense, right, the spirit is willing, but the body is going, no, I don't think so, right? It's this dichotomy of our lives, right? We know what we should do, and yet we fail to do it, or we struggle in doing it. And there's a constant war, in a sense, right, that's happening within our own souls. In Scripture and New Testament, there's a great saying by Paul. He says, I do not do what I want, for if I did what I wanted, I would not do the things that I do. And I sit there and I go, whoa, that's me. Yep. Sign me up for that one. That is me 100%. But again, it's the humanness. And I think that in recovery, my compassion too for others and truly understanding it has made me just more empathetic towards others.
Yeah.
And recognize that. Go ahead.
No, I think, part of where I see a lot of struggle and a lot of stress, even in myself, is, you don't ever arrive at healed. You don't ever, it doesn't stop, right? And I think we can be so hard on ourselves. I'm somebody who strives for perfection. It is like probably my second favorite addiction is perfection. And I can be really hard on myself when things aren't going well, or I'm failing, right? Or things are falling apart. And, I forget that this is all this is the name of the game, right? And it's not happening to me because I'm somebody in recovery. It's happening to me because I'm a human that lives on this planet. And when I can kind of remind myself that what I go through isn't just this like singular, unicorn experience, that people all over are going through things in their own way, it softens me to my own suffering. It softens me to other people's suffering. I came to a Buddhist practice after I was diagnosed with a brain tumor almost 8 years ago, and I had to have brain surgery and radiation, and I went through a lot with it. And I remember when I got diagnosed, one of the first things that I said, because I'm a very healthy person, I live a very active, healthy lifestyle, and I literally said out loud, "But I drink green juice. Like, this isn't supposed to happen," you know? And I remember my neurosurgeon being like, "That has nothing to do with what's happening right now," you know? And like that sense of, wait, this is so unfair. This isn't supposed to happen to me. And what my practice and my recovery has taught me is that it's supposed to happen to me because I'm part of this world. I'm not elect, right? I'm not exempt from hard things just because I got sober. I'm still part of the whole thing. And with that comes a many array of different experiences, beautiful things and really hard things. But when we, in Buddhism, they often talk about like the death of the ego, right? We have to just rid ourselves of the attachment to wanting things to be how I want them to, and the aversion to things that are uncomfortable or displeasing to me. And when we do that, we can just go, okay, right now it's like this, right? This is my experience. And the more I can hold that, the more empathetic I am to myself and to others.
I think you're right. I think addicts in general, and I've learned a lot of this in recovery, is that they are highly self-critical.
Yes.
I've found myself, even just like some of the things that I've said to somebody else, I've been like, did I say that the right way? Is that going to be misconstrued the wrong way? I didn't mean it that way, if that's the way they thought. And, and I make the statement about, the addict's brain is moving at, twice the speed of a normal, a normie, if you will.
Yeah.
And with that comes all the realities of, wanting to get perfection and it's a struggle for peace. It's a struggle for, feeling okay about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
This is good stuff. I appreciate this. This has been fascinating. Let's get into your business.
Okay.
So Holistic Healing Path.
Yeah.
What is your overall approach to therapy?
So my overall approach to therapy is that there is no one size fits all. I am a firm believer that recovery is super individual to the person who's experiencing it. So I've been working in the field for 14 years. I have worked in every single level of care, inpatient, outpatient, detoxes. I've seen and done it all. I've worked every job from a behavioral tech, and now I'm a director, right? So I've run the gamut. And what I saw in treatment was, this huge group of people who were not necessarily benefiting or understanding or just kind of vibing with traditional approaches to recovery. And what I found was that they were kind of being just towed under, like, okay, well, try it again. You're not doing it right. You're not giving it this. Like, there wasn't a conversation of, okay, so if that doesn't work for you, what will? Right? It was very much this idea of, well, if you don't think that that's working for you, then that's because you're not doing it correctly and you're not being honest and you're not being willing. And it's like, okay, but what if maybe that's just not for them, right? What do we do with those people? What do we do with that whole group of people who it's just not their vibe? And I'm one of those people, right? So I started my, recovery in traditional 12-step meetings. I did that for years. I did that for about 5 years. And it just didn't fill my cup the way that it seemed like it did for other people. And when I kind of transitioned away from that, I got a lot of kind of feedback of like, wow, if you leave meetings, like, that's it, you're done, and I'm like, well, I just can't personally believe that to be true. I can't believe that if I don't do this one thing, I lose everything. Like, there has to be other ways of doing this. Right. And so that kind of started my own journey of, yoga and mindfulness and meditation and changing, the way I eat and addressing my own behavioral patterns and all of these things. And so then Holistic Healing Path was kind of born at my kitchen table. In like 2015, I was working in a facility and I just was like, we need to give them more. There has to be more. And that's when I kind of created the program that I originally ran. So I ran my program inside of a treatment center for about 5 years. People who worked with me were assessed as they came into inpatient treatment, and they elected to participate in my program. And it was phenomenal. We had, it was just probably one of the highlights of my career was running that program. And so I did that for 5 years, and then COVID hit, and it really changed the landscape of inpatient treatment and really impacted the way that my program ran. And I kind of decided at that point to pivot from running inside programs to moving to more independent, doing my own thing. I continue to work at a facility now. I love the facility that I'm at. I work at Harbor Wellness and Recovery Center in New Jersey, a little plug there. But I do, my own thing on the side. And so that's when I started getting into, I'm also a past life regression therapist. Because I believe in, healing in many different planes. I'm somebody that, I do understand that we can do a lot in traditional therapy. And then I think there's a lot that we need to access through other modalities. So my main passion is giving people as many resources as possible to helping them build whatever this is going to look like for them. I always say, I don't care how you come to the table. I just care that you eat. So whatever we can do to make that happen, whether that's coaching, whether that's yoga, whether that's looking into Ayurvedic lifestyles, whatever, getting back into meetings, there's thousands of ways to do this. And I don't think we talk about that enough in recovery, of giving people permission to do it differently.
I like it. How can you tell if your therapy is working? What's the evidence that you see?
In traditional therapy, the biggest marker is that we're maintaining sobriety, right? So that's kind of like the number one thing is are we staying sober, right? And so if somebody's staying sober for a period of time and doing well with that, that's kind of the foundational piece that I look for. Then secondary to that is I start looking at their interpersonal relationships. Right? How are things going with your loved ones? How are things going at your job? How are things going in other aspects of your life, right? Are you staying sober, but you're coming to me and saying, oh my God, I got into a fight with my boss again, and me and my wife are arguing, and, I'm having so much trouble with my kid. Are you still experiencing interpersonal issue? And if you are, then we may need to start addressing it's not because of the world, right? Because I know for many addicts and alcoholics, we want the problem to be external so the solution can be external. But the truth is the problem is always internal. And so that means the solution is internal. So instead of focusing on, your boss who sucks and your relationship that you're unhappy in, it's come back to, well, what are you bringing to that, right? What's your stuff there? And so I start to see when people resolve interpersonal problems and they start to function more skillfully in their day-to-day interactions, that's how I really know people are integrating what we're talking about in our sessions into their daily lives. Because you probably know, I know, you can get sober and not change a thing about yourself and continue to be miserable for the rest of your life. And congratulations, you have 30 years not drinking. That's no fun. At that point, just start drinking again because you're probably less miserable. This is the whole thing here is freedom. Right. And so if we're going to be shackled by our misery, then what are we really doing? And so I look at it as does my client experience continued increases in freedom, whether that be emotional freedom, mental freedom, physical freedom, right? Are they continuing to level up and up? And as I see that, I know we're doing something right.
Well said. I think that there's this notion that we have to white knuckle it, and that just makes for a miserable life. It ends up feeling like a death sentence. And I think that's a lot of people's notions about not getting sober or not using is because that's their only source of joy. And if that's the case, well then there's some things that are misaligned here. So let's go back, because we know obviously too chemically that we're just constantly looking to try to get our brain and our dopamine and everything back to normal levels, that when we come off of it, right, we're going to be in a deficit for a while. So there's going to be nothing that we're going to find joy in. So we have to give the body time to back to self-regulate. But things do become more joyful again. And that should be the point of sobriety, because, for the most part, we just don't all of a sudden end up one day being an addict. It's something that creeps into our life, and it becomes progressively worse. And I think that's important for people to hear, because again, society is tough as it is with, beer commercials and TV shows and all these things that that they just assume that's the norm, and it really doesn't have to be.
No.
I'm thankful that fortunately it seems like there is a tide shifting a little bit, especially from, the celebrities and things like that, talking about how, their sobriety has been godsends from a range of people, right? Bradley Cooper, Anne Hathaway, Robert Downey Jr., all these people have testified to the joys of coming out of it, and just the clarity that they have and the peace that they have.
Yep.
And you're not going to know it until you make the jump.
Yeah. I usually tell people to expect kind of like recovery. What I have found for most people is, at first there's a little bit of alleviation, right? At first things get a little better just because you're inherently not making dangerous, life altering choices. Things just kind of get a little bit calmer. It doesn't inherently feel better, but it's like, woo, okay. Then it usually gets worse. Right? Because then now you really settle in and you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I like to call the buyer's remorse phase of recovery. That's when you go, did I really want this? Like, this does not feel like what I wanted it to feel like, right? And so you kind of go through buyer's remorse and you work with that part where it kind of dips down. And then I tell people it gets different. And different can look like a lot of things. And you start kind of looking around your life and you start seeing things differently, right? Whatever that is, your relationship that you were in before you got sober, your job, your spirituality, you just start seeing differences. And then it stabilizes. Then you get into your groove, right? And that process can take years, right? And I am somebody who tells people all the time, if you think after 6 months versus years in active addiction, you are going to balance those scales, I promise you that you will be disappointed, right? Give yourself the time. Know that this is going to take a while, and it does get better. It does get easier. You will laugh, you will smile, you will enjoy things. But I just had a client tell me the other day, he's back in recovery, and we were just talking, and he said, dopamine's not free anymore. And I'm like, yeah, that's correct, right? You're like, right now your dopamine isn't free. You're going to have to work for it. You're really going to have to dig in deep to find it. And eventually if you get it back, eventually it's free again. But for this first little while, yeah, you're going to have to really push the threshold.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're a dopamine nation, right? We're constantly getting inputs that's constantly triggering it. To the suffering addict who hasn't thought about seeking help, what's the one thing that you wish that they knew?
That people are waiting for you, that there are people who are waiting for you to get sober to help them get sober. That there's a whole line of people after you that need you to be in recovery to help them get into recovery. And whether that is through meetings or meeting somebody at the grocery store. I know that there are people who wait on you. And once you are well and sober and doing your work, they will find you and they will say, oh my God, you're exactly who I needed to hear this from. And that is, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that like that is the whole name of, like, that's the whole purpose, right? Is to be a little bit more light for people who don't quite see it yet. And when you're in the thick of it, I can guarantee very little in my profession. I tell people that all the time, that I can make very few guarantees as somebody who works in the field of addiction, right? It is such a difficult field and so much goes into it. But what I can guarantee is if you do the work, if you stay sober long enough, you heal enough, somebody is going to look at you and say, I've waited to hear your story. Thank you so much for being here. And that's what I would hope a suffering addict remembers, is that there's so many people who are waiting for you.
Well said. I just had that experience just a couple of weeks ago. So I've gone through an intensive inpatient, and then I went to an intensive outpatient for 3 months, and now I'm in an aftercare program where it's literally just us round tabling it once a week, and just talking about our week, talking about the highs and the lows. And we have people that are in IOP that basically join for the second half after we leave, but they're allowed to basically sit in and listen to us. And there's a young gentleman who's battling marijuana and alcohol. And I had heard him say some things, and I'm just like, I know exactly how he feels. And so I responded to him, and my counselor actually texted me and said, man, you hit the nail right on the head for him. He came to me afterwards and was like, oh my God, somebody finally gets me. And it's like, yeah, it's so powerful. It's so liberating. And again, it's the loneliness diminishes. It's, hey, no, we understand. We're not going to judge you, and we get it. And we're there rooting, cheering you on. Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You've talked about AA, and mental health. So
yeah,
I knew that I was battling. I had like 3 major depressive episodes in my life.
Yeah.
And the first one was back around 2009, 2010. I've dealt with a lot of trauma in my life as well. Lost a daughter unexpectedly. Father dropped dead on me one day. Businesses failed. I had to basically pack up the house and the family. And so I know that I didn't process grief very well. I know I probably just bottled it up or I just used to basically push it on down the road. But with the mental health aspect, because I'm seeing a psychiatrist, I'm seeing a psychologist, and I'm on an antidepressant. I was on an anxiety med, and those things were godsends, just godsends, because it finally got me stable as well. But I know also that the ones that are white knuckling it, I think that they're averse to getting that other side of help, right?
Yeah.
Because they've inadvertently been self-medicating for so long because they've been hiding this other issue. And I see it with brilliant people. I mean, again, we know this disease doesn't discriminate. I've met some extremely bright people. I mean, just amazing people. And most of the people that I've met are absolutely amazing and it's successful. And obviously our society doesn't help, with the keeping up with the Joneses and with the pressure and the push and everything. But I've also seen young, brilliant people that have just continually relapsed, like from the age that you basically got clean. I've watched them, repeatedly, and it's tough because, they still can't get their meds right.
Yeah.
But from the AA side, as soon as I recognized that my mental health was in line, I literally have felt the need. I've felt no need to go there. I literally have. I mean, I was uber involved on the front end, sharing my story, empathizing and everything else. But I also have my notion of pros and cons, which is something I'm actually going to do for an episode soon, because I know that it sometimes can be the luck of the draw of finding the right group. Yeah. But I think that that's important to understand, is that, the beauty of AA is that if you have nowhere else to go, if you don't have the insurances to get the correct help, you can start there and you can get a system in, but it can also be cliquey. It can be very cliquey. It can be a lot of old timers, unfortunately, that have this only one rigid way of getting help. And this is the way that you have to do it. And if you don't, you're going to fall off. And I think that that's not true. I think that, the understanding of addiction is evolving. And I think that it's a wonderful thing that people like you are offering, tons of modalities on how to help yourself and getting through this and living a fruitful life, and not just being miserable, come home from work every day, I go to bed, I wake up, I do this, and it's just, life is just miserable. And that's not the point of sobriety. It's living life to the fullest.
Absolutely. And I have my own, I have hot takes about AA and NA and 12-step recovery. It's not something that I do. I haven't been to meetings in, over a decade plus. I think there's a lot of wonderful benefits of it. And I also found that it could be really difficult. It can be a challenging environment to be in, depending on who you are and how you work with that. And so that's why I'm so passionate about giving people permission to say that doesn't work for me. And I'm willing to figure out something that does, right? I tell anybody that I work with that you're allowed to say that something doesn't work for you after you've tried it, you've really put forth effort, and then commit to do something else. You can't just say, I don't like that. I've never done it, but I don't think I'm going to like it. And that's it, right? I'm only successful, and I tell people this, that I'm not successful because I don't do meetings. I'm successful because I transitioned from meetings to other communities, and I found other places to get support that are not recovery oriented, right? Like the people who are in my life, who are most involved in my life, none of them are in recovery. My best friend of 11 years, she's not in sobriety. She doesn't drink. She doesn't do anything, but she's not a recovering person. She has her own things. My parents, a couple of my other friends, but I don't have this recovery community around me. I have a community around me. And I think it's okay to normalize that it doesn't always have to be other recovering people who are part of your community. It can be anybody, as long as they're committed to their own healing, they work on themselves, they're honest with you, and they hold you accountable. And I think if you have those components, it doesn't have to just be, oh, if you're not in recovery, you don't get what I'm going through. I don't think that's true. I think anybody can get what you're going through, because suffering is universal. And if somebody says to me, meetings don't work for me, okay, let's find out what does. Let's find you the spaces and the places that do, instead of going, well, that's because you're not working hard enough. It's because you're not doing them right. It's because you're not willing enough. It's like, that's not true all the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree. Oh, okay. Bonus question.
Okay.
The three biggest mistakes that lead to relapse.
Good ones. The first one I would say is not having a community. Yeah. I think the first thing is isolating yourself from anybody, right? Whoever that might be, your family, your friends, your meetings, your yoga studio, your meditation group, whoever it is, cutting yourself off, making yourself an island that you can't get off and other people can't get on, right? That's the first thing, is just slowly starting to make your life really, really, really small. That's the first thing that I see. The second thing that I see as one of the biggest mistakes is expectations. Expectations for how you're supposed to be at 1 year sober, how your family is supposed to treat you at 2 years sober, what your life was supposed to be. Let go, right? Let go of what you think it's all going to look like and lean into the natural evolution. I always tell people that my phrase of recovery is hold the vision, right? The vision is you in sobriety, and be flexible in the form, because there are going to be a million twists and turns on this process. And if what you think has to happen doesn't come to fruition, those unmet expectations are the destroyers of people's hope. And so letting go of what you think it's all supposed to be and just showing up, doing the work of it. And then probably 3 would be not addressing underlying issues, not going beyond just the fact that you have a substance use disorder. What is behind that, right? I'm a certified clinical trauma professional. So I work with a lot of trauma people. I teach trauma. I do all of that. I'm very trauma informed. And so to me, it's like, what aren't you addressing, right? What is beyond? Because the substance use is the fire. We need to figure out the coals. And if you go through the rest of your life with hot coals, you're always going to have these flare-ups. At a certain point, you have to get down and you have to get to the root of things. You can't just keep addressing the fiery symptoms, right? And so I think when people just stop with, well, I stopped using and drinking, that'll be sufficient. I can tell you from professional experience, it's not. And, it's never about what it's about. So go a little deeper.
I love it. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I think that especially number 3, you hit the nail on the head. The addiction is the effect. What was the cause? What was the cause that instigated that addiction to get to the point it did? Number 1, the community. Yes. I know that I was isolating fervently when I was getting worse and worse, and that there's nothing good that comes from that. And I appreciate number 2, because Yeah, we wanted to find, especially going into recovery to start with, right? You're like, okay, I got 30 days. You're going to teach me a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to leave here and I'm going to take off and I'm going to use it in my life and things are going to be fabulous. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I remember the first week that I was home before I got into my IOP, I was like, okay, now what?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, wow, okay, now I got to live life. And thank God that I had that IOP afterwards, because I was like, yeah, no, I'm still not ready yet. I still need to keep going here. And I need to keep these wheels churning, to develop these new habits, these good new habits, and be willing to live life on life's terms.
Yeah.
The good and the bad, wholly feeling everything and not running from it. Ashley, this has been amazing. So, Holistic Healing Path, you're based out of New Jersey, and you're doing a lot of telehealth, which is awesome, because I think that people's time is precious, and trying to get somewhere in person becomes difficult. But if you can meet them where they're at, that's a wonderful, wonderful support that you're offering. Thank you for that. And the floor is yours. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on tonight that you feel was important? Anything that you had for notes that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I always try to advocate and make sure is touched on in any recovery process and just life process is this importance of finding your value, right? And rediscovering what is inherently your birthright, which is that you are a valuable human being just because you exist, right? And we are such a culture of value is based on productivity and what you do and your measures and all of these things. And when you're getting sober and rebuilding your life, you may not have anything, right? You are sometimes starting from scratch. And so if we continue to put that value external of us, that it's about my job or my money or my car, all of those things, it will constantly feel like we'll never get there. And I want people to know and really come to that place of like the conclusion of that you are valuable from the minute that you entered this world. That's non-negotiable. And you never have to justify your value ever. And so if we can all kind of like sit with that and really absorb that, then the things that we do in this life, the beautiful things that we get to do, the relationships that we get to have, the experiences that we get to have, they only add to our value, right? They don't create it. And that's something that's been so important to me because I struggle with my own value. I struggle with imposter syndrome. Like I constantly think like somebody's going to come to my job and be like, who let her in here? You know what I mean? Like, how did she, right? And I'm a master's level person. I have all the experience and I still think somebody's going to knock on my office door and be like, you're a fraud, right? And it's like, I have to convince myself like, no, I know what I'm doing. Like even coming on this podcast and people are like, oh, how are you so excited? And I'm like, I'm nervous. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, you know that this is your life. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Like I know this. Right. And so I think sometimes we're a culture of doubt because doubt keeps people sick and doubt keeps people afraid. And that's where like a lot of the trauma and hard and toxicity can breed is in doubt. And so just remind yourself and really sit with yourself of this idea that like, you know, what's best for you, even if people tell you you don't. There's an inner knowing deep in your bones that you know what you're up to unhealthily, and you also know what you need to do. And so trust that and trust that value, trust that little voice, and then get other people in your life who will make that voice louder, because you don't have to find that outside of yourself. You just have to actually come home to it.
Wonderful, Ashley. You know, you've given me so many gems tonight, so many nuggets of truth. And I couldn't agree with you more. We're living a life where I've got to find it in a relationship. I've got to find it in my job. I got to find it in the size of my house and my bank account and the car that I'm driving. And yeah, I mean, the recovery is a selfish thing, but it's a good selfishness, right? It's a self-care. It's a getting back to truly who you are, being whole with yourself, right? Because everything else will just be a value add, right? It will no longer be filling a void. It will be a value add. And I think that's a wonderful way to end this episode. You've been a wealth of knowledge. I'm definitely going to be hitting you up again with more information. We're going to have to do this again soon.
I'd love to.
And I'll present you a whole new set of questions. Thank you so much for your time. And I know it's getting late out there, but I truly appreciate your time. Your story is fascinating, and I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of people. Okay.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a pleasure. I'd love to do it again.
Awesome. My pleasure. Hey, have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.